I came home early and caught my husband in bed with my cousin. He smirked, thinking I would break down. Instead, I picked up my phone, made one call and said, "It's time." His smile faded when my lawyer walked in with documents that changed everything. I barely stepped through the front door, still reeling from the long, exhausting work trip, when I felt a strange tension settle over me. It wasn't the usual relief of being home after days away. It was something else, something unsettling. The house felt different, quieter than usual. Maybe it was just my tired mind, but something tugged at my instincts. I dropped my bag on the floor and walked into the house, already thinking about getting a warm shower and unwinding in front of the TV. But then I heard something, soft laughter. Not the kind that belonged to me. My pulse quickened, my heart thudding louder in my chest. My stomach churned and I hesitated just for a moment. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling of unease only grew. I wasn't prepared for what I saw when I opened the bedroom door. There in our bed was John, my husband, and lying next to him, Katie, my cousin. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. My mind couldn't wrap around what my eyes were seeing. They were tangled in the sheets, and John's eyes, those eyes, met mine first. He didn't look shocked. In fact, there was a smugness there, a look that said he expected me to collapse, to fall apart, to cry. And part of me wanted to do exactly that. I could feel the tears welling up, the anger rising in my chest. But then something else took over. A voice deep inside me, one I hadn't heard in a while, reminded me not to show weakness. Not now. Not when I had the power to take control. Before we dive in, I just want to thank each of you for being part of this journey. Your support means the world. If you found strength in these stories, consider subscribing. It's free and helps us grow this incredible community. Let's get started. I froze for a moment, fighting the urge to scream, to shout, to demand answers. But I didn't. Instead, I just stood there holding my breath, taking it all in. The betrayal. The humiliation. The cold, raw sting of having my trust shattered by both of them, the people who should have never done this to me. John's face twisted into a grin, his expression almost mocking, like he thought he'd won. I could almost hear his silent words. "What are you going to do now, Tessa? Cry? Beg for answers?" I didn't give him the satisfaction. I didn't say anything. I just walked out of the room and closed the door behind me, trying to steady my breathing. Every part of me wanted to collapse to the floor, to give in to the overwhelming wave of hurt and confusion. But I couldn't. Not like this. I had to think clearly. I had to do this on my terms. I made my way down the hall, my steps steady though my mind was racing. I knew I couldn't let them see my weakness. They thought they'd broken me, but they were wrong. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I'd been through too much to let something like this destroy me. I didn't waste time. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed a number. My lawyer, David. He had been there for me through every major decision, every contract, every tough choice. He wasn't just my lawyer, he was someone I trusted. And now he was about to become my ally in a war I hadn't planned to fight. The phone rang twice before he picked up. His voice, calm and familiar, eased the tension in my chest just a little. "Tessa, what's up?" "It's time," I said, my voice sounding steady, even though inside I felt like I was about to break. But I wouldn't. Not now. Not when this was just the beginning. There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost hear him processing the weight of my words. "Are you sure?" he asked, cautious but firm. "Yes," I replied, my voice gaining strength. "We're going after both of them." I heard the quiet shift in David's tone, the understanding. This was no longer about a simple divorce. This was about something deeper. About the years of manipulation, the trust that had been torn apart, the lies they had built together. It wasn't just about John. It wasn't even just about Katie. This was about me taking back control. "I'll get everything in motion," he said. "It's going to be a battle, Tessa. Are you ready for this?" "More than you know," I said, hanging up. And for the first time since I walked into that room, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Strength. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to beg for answers. I was going to take everything from them, everything they thought they could steal from me. Financially, legally, every way possible. They weren't going to get away with this. As I stood in the hallway, I felt my anger turning into something else. Something cold, calculated. I wasn't going to run from this. I wasn't going to cower. I was going to be the one in control. And they had no idea what was coming. The silence in the house was deafening as I sat in the study, surrounded by piles of documents. My heart was still reeling from the shock of the betrayal, but my mind was already shifting gears. I wasn't going to be a victim. I wasn't going to let John or Katie continue to manipulate me, to feed off me. I was going to find every piece of this puzzle and expose them both for who they truly were. I started with the bank statements, the ones I'd ignored for too long. I had trusted John with the financials, assuming he was doing what was best for our family. But now looking at them I couldn't help but feel sick. How had I been so blind? Each line seemed to bleed into the next, but then I saw it. A pattern. Small charges, often less than $100, all going to businesses and accounts I didn't recognize. The amounts were insignificant enough not to raise alarms at first glance. But now, under the weight of what I knew, every one of them felt like a betrayal. It was a game to them, a slow and steady siphoning off of our resources hidden in plain sight. I picked up the phone and dialed David, needing his expertise. The conversation was brief, but the weight of his words hung heavy on me. Look deeper, Tessa. This isn't just about personal betrayal. There's more here, I'm sure of it. I didn't need more urging. I had already begun to sense the truth. I wasn't just being cheated on, I was being used. Used by my husband. Used by my cousin. But what had they really been after? The more I dug, the more I realized how deep this web of deceit ran. Katie had always been the charming, attentive cousin. The one who listened when I needed to vent, who gave advice when I asked for it. But now I started to see it differently. I thought I'd been confiding in her, but the truth was she had been quietly gathering ammunition. Every time I'd shared something personal, something about my dreams or my doubts, Katie had been feeding it back to John, twisting my words, shaping my thoughts to suit their needs. It was a slow revelation, but the deeper I dug, the clearer it became. Katie wasn't just close to me, she was playing a game of manipulation with me as the pawn. And that, above everything, hurt the most. She was family. She was supposed to be someone I could trust, someone who would protect me. But instead she had been working alongside John to tear me down from the inside. The betrayal felt like a physical weight on my chest. My breath was shallow and my hands trembled as I flipped through more paperwork. But it wasn't just idle chatter or stolen moments of intimacy. They had turned my own financial decisions into their advantage. I could see it now clearer than ever. The house I thought we'd bought as a family home, the vacations I had believed were just our way of reconnecting. It had all been part of their plan. They weren't just cheating on me emotionally, they were robbing me. They had been siphoning off my hard work, my efforts. I could feel the anger starting to build in my chest again, hotter and fiercer than before. This wasn't just a betrayal of love. This was a betrayal of everything I had built. My career, my sacrifices, my dreams. But I wasn't about to let them get away with it. Late that night, after hours of digging through records and going over receipts, I came across something that shook me to my core. There, buried in a stack of tax filings, was a business venture that John and Katie had been running together. It wasn't a small side project. It was a full-blown operation funded with money from my own accounts. The debts, the loans, the investments, they had been using me to fuel their secret business, all while pretending to be the loving, supportive couple I thought I knew. I sat back in the chair, my mind racing. This was more than just an affair. It wasn't just John and Katie sneaking around behind my back. This was a calculated, ruthless betrayal. They had been using me as a stepping stone, taking from me while pretending to care. Every penny I thought had gone toward our family's future had been funneled into their business. A business I didn't even know existed. The rage I felt burned hotter than anything I'd ever experienced. I wanted to scream, to throw everything in the room to the ground. But I couldn't afford to lose control. Not now. Not when I had come so far. I needed more proof. I needed to know exactly how deep this went. So I kept going. I pulled out more documents, more records. I started to see how the pieces fit together. A secret account in both their names, transactions that led nowhere, business expenses that shouldn't have been charged to our household. John had always been careful about how he hid things, but Katie was the perfect partner in this crime. She had the perfect role, the perfect disguise as my cousin, someone I'd never suspect. She knew the ins and outs of my life, my finances, and she used that information to manipulate me, to make decisions that would inevitably benefit them. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how much they had planned. This wasn't just about an affair. It wasn't about a fleeting moment of weakness or a stray temptation. This was a long-term strategy. They had been setting me up for years and I had never once suspected a thing. The manipulation had been so subtle, so slow, that I hadn't even noticed the way my trust had been chipped away, piece by piece, until I was left with nothing. I remember sitting at the desk that night, surrounded by the evidence of their deception, feeling a strange mix of disbelief and clarity. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was determined. I wasn't going to let them destroy me. I was going to make sure they paid for what they had done. Not just emotionally but financially, legally, and every other way I could. Each piece of evidence felt like a victory, a small step closer to exposing their treachery. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. They would know without a shadow of a doubt what they had done. As the hours passed, the realization grew within me. I wasn't just a victim. I was the one in control now. And I wasn't going to stop until I had everything, until I had taken back what they had stolen from me. I was done being blind. I was done being manipulated. The game was on and I was going to make sure it ended in my favor. The days stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. I had seen the destruction of my life in an instant, but I knew deep in my gut that I couldn't react just yet. As much as I wanted to confront John and Katie, tear them apart right there and then, I knew it would only give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. But I would not give them that. I had spent years building my life, my reputation, my marriage, and I wasn't about to destroy it all in a fit of rage. So I did what I'd never done before. I waited. I let my anger burn, but I let it smolder quietly, turning into something far more dangerous. It was hard, so hard to hold back. Every time I saw John, my stomach churned. Every time Katie smiled at me like nothing was wrong, a wave of disgust washed over me. But I didn't let it show. Instead, I became the picture of calm. In public, I was everything they thought they knew about me. A dutiful wife, a loving cousin, the woman who had no idea the people closest to her were stabbing her in the back. I acted normal, even friendly. I made small talk at family gatherings, and when John made a joke, I laughed. It was all a performance, a mask that covered the burning rage beneath. They had no idea that while they thought they were winning, they were walking straight into my trap. I spent hours each night poring over documents, researching every transaction, every business deal, every account. I didn't trust anyone but myself. Consulting with David, my lawyer, became a nightly ritual. He was a rock, always calm, always steady, but I could hear the urgency in his voice as I shared more pieces of the puzzle with him. "You're on the right track, Tessa," he would say. "But you need to be patient. Let's get everything in place before we make our move." And I listened. I had learned the hard way that revenge, when rushed, could turn into a disaster. Could backfire. I couldn't afford that. I needed to make sure my position was unassailable. So I worked in silence, letting the evidence accumulate, carefully arranging each piece, ensuring that when I finally did strike, nothing would be left to chance. During the day, I lived my life like nothing had changed. I worked, I went to the gym, I met friends for coffee. I kept everything normal. At night, I would return to my study, the walls of my sanctuary where I could breathe and think clearly. The house felt like a shell, an empty reminder of what had been. I wasn't just living with the betrayal. I was preparing for war. I didn't need to show my emotions. They would come later, when everything had been set into motion. I could feel the tension building inside me. Every time I saw John, I wanted to grab him by the collar and scream in his face, but I held back. Every time Katie spoke to me, I felt the urge to slap the smile off her face. But I didn't. I would let them think they had me fooled. I wanted them to feel comfortable. To feel safe. That's when they'd make their mistake. I spent hours on the phone with the private investigator I'd hired, making sure every angle was covered. I needed everything. Every hidden account, every false invoice, every shady business deal. John and Katie hadn't just lied to me. They had been operating in a world of deceit, stealing from me and building a life based on my hard work, my money. They had used me as a tool, a means to an end, but they had no idea what was coming for them. The investigators' reports came in one after another, like pieces of a puzzle that finally fit. Hidden offshore accounts, falsified signatures, loans that were never disclosed to me. Everything. I was shaking with rage every time I read another report, but I didn't let it consume me. The anger wasn't the point anymore. I wasn't some victim anymore. I was a strategist, a woman on a mission. My only focus was making sure they paid for what they had done. And I would be the one to make sure it happened. As the days passed, I started to feel the shift inside me. I wasn't just healing. I wasn't just waiting. I was becoming something else. The woman who walked into that bedroom broken and betrayed had disappeared. In her place stood a woman who was calm, cold, calculating. I wasn't going to let them take anything more from me. I wasn't going to let them win. I started to plan every detail. I made sure I had all the evidence I needed. I made sure every conversation with David was logged, every phone call recorded. When the time came, I would strike hard and I would strike fast. There would be no mercy. Even as I walked through the motions of daily life, I was already 2 steps ahead of them. When John asked if I wanted to go to dinner with him and Katie, I smiled and agreed. I could feel his eyes on me, searching for any sign that I knew. But there was nothing. I knew the game we were playing and I was winning it. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about control. It was about taking everything back. Everything they had stolen from me I would reclaim. And when I was done they would have nothing. John and Katie would have no business, no assets, no trust. Their entire empire, built on lies, would crumble beneath their feet. As the days turned into weeks, I could feel the tension inside me reaching its peak. I was ready. But I knew I couldn't make my move too soon. I had to wait for the right moment. The moment when they would least expect it. I had to let them continue down their path, blind to what was coming. They were making mistakes, small ones, but they were adding up. Every mistake they made would be another nail in their coffin. And when the time was right, I would strike. I wasn't just going to ruin their lives. I was going to ruin their lives in a way that left no question about who had the power now. Tessa was no longer the woman who had been betrayed. Tessa was the woman who had taken control, who had outsmarted them at their own game. And when everything was in place, I would take everything back. Patience had become my weapon and I was about to use it to destroy them. The clock had been ticking down for weeks. I had felt the weight of every second leading to this moment. But now, as the door clicked open and my lawyer entered with a folder in hand, it felt as though the room itself had shifted. The air was thick with anticipation, a heaviness that settled deep in my chest. I had worked too hard, waited too long to let this moment slip by. It was time. David, my lawyer, walked over to the table and laid down the divorce papers first, followed by a thick stack of financial records. Each sheet felt like a victory, each one a nail in John and Katie's coffin. The last document he placed down was the injunction. Its impact would be immediate, its consequences irreversible. It would freeze every last cent John had, every account, every asset until further notice. I knew what it meant for them. But more importantly, I knew what it meant for me. It was my control, my reclamation of everything they had taken from me, and now it was in my hands. David gave me a look. Calm, professional. But I could see the recognition in his eyes. This wasn't just a divorce. This was a declaration of war. I nodded, my hands steady despite the pounding of my heart. I knew this wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring that John and Katie would never get away with what they had done. They had stolen from me in ways I never imagined, and this was the reckoning. Do you want to say something before we proceed? David asked, though his tone suggested he already knew my answer. I shook my head. There was nothing left to say. My silence would speak louder than any words ever could. I had long passed the point of pleading or begging. This wasn't about me being a victim anymore. This was about them paying for their betrayal. They had underestimated me and now they were going to feel the consequences. When the documents were handed over, the moment felt almost surreal. I could see John's face as I placed the papers in front of him. His cocky, self-assured expression faltered, just for a moment, before he quickly masked it with confusion. He glanced at Katie, whose face turned pale when she saw the divorce papers. I could almost hear her thoughts. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't supposed to happen. But I knew it was coming. They had lived their lives as if they were untouchable, hiding behind lies and deceit, manipulating everything in their path. But the truth had finally caught up to them, and it was crushing them in ways they couldn't have imagined. Is this a joke? John's voice trembled just slightly. Tessa, what is this? His panic was barely masked by his attempt at bravado. It was almost laughable. This was the same man who had manipulated me for years, yet now he was struggling to make sense of the consequences. I didn't need to say anything. The papers did all the talking for me. I watched as he scanned the divorce papers, his eyes darting to the financial documents, to the injunction. His breath hitched as the reality of what was happening set in. His empire, everything he had built off my trust and my money, was crumbling in front of him. He could no longer pretend that he was in control. I had taken that from him and he knew it. Katie stood there too, frozen. Her initial shock faded into a slow, simmering panic. I could see her trying to piece it all together, trying to figure out how this had happened, how she had been outplayed. But I had been 10 steps ahead of her. For months, I had watched her play the part of the dutiful cousin, the supportive friend, all while stabbing me in the back. She thought she could pull the strings, that she could manipulate me into doing her bidding, but now the tables had turned. She would never have the control she once thought she held over me again. David looked between the two of them and then back at me. "We're done here. Let's get this filed," he said calmly, his voice not betraying any emotion, but I could feel the subtle excitement in his eyes. This was more than a typical divorce. This was going to be a story people would talk about for years. As we left the room, I felt the weight of the moment settle in. There was no going back. John and Katie were going to have to face the consequences of their actions. Their world was falling apart and there was no one left to shield them from the fallout. When I got back to the house, I stared at the walls for a long time, thinking about everything that had led me to this point. The betrayal. The lies. The quiet manipulation. Every time they had twisted the knife, I had felt it deep inside, but I hadn't been ready to strike. Now I was. And I had made sure that nothing could stop me. The next few days felt like a strange kind of calm, as if the storm had passed but the thunder was still rumbling in the distance. I knew things would escalate quickly. John was already on the phone with his lawyers, but he would find that there was nothing they could do. The injunction was airtight. Every move he made would be scrutinized and no amount of money or influence would save him now. Katie too would find her world changing. She might have thought she was untouchable, playing the role of the trusted cousin and confidant, but now she was nothing more than a part of John's crumbling empire. The people who had once looked up to her, who had trusted her, would turn away when they saw the truth. There would be no escape for her either. I knew that this wasn't just about taking their money or assets. It was about taking everything from them. Their reputation, their trust, their position in the family. John and Katie had stolen so much from me and now it was time for them to lose it all. They would never be able to rebuild what they had once taken for granted. As the media began to catch wind of the story, I knew it would only get worse for them. Their business dealings were no longer a secret. The lies they had covered up for years would be dragged into the light. John would lose more than his assets, he would lose his reputation and with it the business he had spent his life building. Katie would lose her place in the family, her trust shattered beyond repair. I wasn't just taking back what was mine. I was ensuring that they would never profit from their deceit again. The house felt different now. Emptier somehow. The walls that had once been filled with echoes of laughter, arguments, and shared moments now stood in a tense silence, as if even the structure itself had absorbed the weight of the battles fought within it. I stood in the doorway, my eyes scanning the room, taking in the wreckage I had caused. Every corner, every piece of furniture, every familiar object seemed to be marked by the chaos of the past weeks. But beneath the mess, beneath the brokenness, there was something else. A quiet sense of finality. It was over. John and Katie had no idea what had hit them. They were still scrambling, trying to pick up the pieces of their lives, but I knew they were beyond repair. The life they had built together on lies and deceit was crumbling. But that wasn't what mattered now. What mattered was that I had broken free from the chains that had held me down for so long. I took one last look around the house, lingering for a moment, letting the weight of everything settle in. Then I stepped outside. As soon as I crossed the threshold, I felt it. The air was different. It wasn't just the change in scenery. It was the feeling of a world that had been waiting for me, one I had never dared to embrace fully until now. The burden I had carried for so long, the weight of betrayal, heartbreak, and anger, seemed to lift off my shoulders with each step I took. I didn't feel angry anymore. That was the most surprising part of all. For months, I had been consumed by rage, a fire that threatened to burn me from the inside out. But now, with the finality of the decision behind me, that anger began to melt away. It wasn't forgiveness that I felt, but something deeper, something more liberating. It was freedom. The freedom to be who I had always been, to build the life I had always wanted, without the weight of manipulation or the lies that had suffocated me. I paused on the front steps, looking down at the sidewalk stretching out before me. The road ahead wasn't clear, but it didn't need to be. I had spent so much of my life living in the shadow of others. First John, then Katie, then my own doubts. But now I was in control of my story. The next chapter was mine to write. There was a new strength within me, something I hadn't known I was capable of. The woman who had walked into that room trembling and heartbroken was gone. In her place stood someone more resilient, more certain of herself. I was no longer defined by the past. I turned and locked the door behind me, the sound echoing in the stillness. It wasn't just the door to the house that I was closing. It was the door to a life that had been built on lies. And with that one motion I felt the last tie to that world snap. The sun was low on the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow across the street. I breathed deeply, savoring the fresh air. Felt like I was stepping into a new beginning, and in some ways I was. But there was no room for looking back. No room for wondering if I had done the right thing. The decision had been made and there was no going back now. The pain of the past had shaped me, yes, but it no longer had control over me. As I walked away from the house, I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I felt a sense of purpose stirring inside me. I had been running from myself for so long, from the pain, from the hurt, from the fear of what life might look like without the crutch of my marriage. But now, for the first time in years, I felt like I could stand on my own. The woman who had been betrayed, who had felt small and powerless, was no longer there. I had shed that skin, and what emerged was someone stronger. Someone who had survived and learned from it all. I thought about the road ahead, about what it would mean to rebuild my life from the ground up. It wasn't going to be easy, but nothing worth having ever is. I had no illusions about the challenges that lay before me. The world wouldn't suddenly fall into place just because I had walked away from John. The scars of the past wouldn't magically disappear. But they no longer had the power to hold me back. I had the power now. I walked with a new kind of confidence, my steps steady and sure. It felt like reclaiming my life, like taking back something that had been stolen from me. I wasn't afraid anymore. The woman who once cowered in silence was gone. In her place was someone who knew her worth, someone who had learned the hard way how to stand tall. The first few days were quiet. I didn't rush into anything. I spent time alone, reflecting on the journey I had taken and the woman I had become. It was both a moment of healing and a moment of reckoning. I understood now that pain was not my enemy, it was a teacher. I had allowed myself to be consumed by it for too long, but now I was finally in control of it. I could use it as fuel to build something better, something stronger. But it wasn't just about healing. It was about growth. I began to think about the future, about the things I wanted to do, the life I wanted to build. It wasn't going to be the life I had once imagined with John, but that life was gone now. It was a blank slate and I was the artist. I could create something new, something all my own. In the weeks that followed, I slowly started to put myself back together. I reached out to friends, people I had distanced myself from during the marriage. I began doing things for myself. Small things like taking up yoga again or signing up for a cooking class. Each step was a reminder that I was allowed to take up space in the world, that I didn't have to shrink myself to make others feel comfortable. I also focused on rebuilding my career, something that had been put on the back burner during my marriage. I hadn't realized how much of myself I had given up until I started picking up the pieces again. It was exhilarating, challenging, yes, but exhilarating. I had a fire inside me now, and it wasn't going out anytime soon. And through it all, I learned the most important lesson of all. Power doesn't come from revenge. It doesn't come from making others suffer or watching them fall. Real power comes from owning your own story, from choosing to move forward even when everything around you tells you to stay stuck. The more I walked away from the wreckage of my past, the more I realized that I was the one who held the key to my future. The woman who had once felt broken was now whole, and nothing could take that away from me. As I stood at the edge of a new chapter, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. I was free. In the weeks that followed, I settled into a new rhythm. The chaos of the past, the intensity of my decisions, and the weight of my losses all began to fade into the background. Life moved forward, and so did I. But it wasn't without effort. It wasn't as simple as just waking up one day and deciding to be happy. I had to face the mess that my life had become, one piece at a time. But I was no longer the woman who had been broken by betrayal. I was someone different now, someone who was learning to rebuild. The hardest part, I realized, wasn't the business deals or the loss of my marriage. It was finding myself again. For so many years, I had defined myself through the lens of my relationships. I had been a wife, a daughter, a cousin. Those roles had consumed me, shaped me, and defined the way I saw the world. When those roles disappeared, when the life I had built crumbled, I felt as though I had lost my identity. The woman I saw in the mirror seemed unfamiliar. Who was I now? It took time. But slowly I started to peel back the layers. I took a deep breath and began to explore who I was outside of the roles I had played for so long. I wasn't just the woman who had been betrayed. I wasn't just the woman whose marriage had fallen apart. I was someone with desires, ambitions, and dreams that had been put on hold for far too long. And it was time to reclaim them. At first I focused on small things. Simple pleasures I had neglected. I rediscovered hobbies I once loved. Reading novels that had once filled me with joy, sketching in a notebook just for myself, and taking walks through the city streets without worrying about anything other than the present moment. These were little victories, but they were important ones. They were the building blocks of my healing. But soon I realized that it wasn't enough to rebuild my personal life. I had to reclaim my professional identity too. For too long I had put my career on the back burner, always supporting others but never fully supporting myself. I had neglected my passions, the things that had once driven me for the sake of my marriage and my family. Now I had the time and the freedom to pour myself into those passions once again. I started small. A freelance project here, a collaboration there. The first few steps felt shaky, like I was learning to walk again after years of stumbling. But with each success, however small, my confidence grew. I started to trust my instincts once more, and I felt the fire that had been smoldering inside me for years begin to reignite. It wasn't just about business success. It was about finding joy in the work I did. I rediscovered a side of myself I had buried, and it felt like an awakening. As my career began to thrive again, I made a conscious effort to surround myself with people who were different from the toxic influences of my past. No more manipulative friends, no more hollow relationships that drained me. I surrounded myself with individuals who lifted me up, who genuinely supported me. People who showed me what true loyalty and trust looked like. There was no pretension in these new relationships. They were honest, grounded, and most importantly, real. I made new friends, real friends. People who didn't care about my past or the mistakes I'd made, who didn't view me through the lens of the woman who had been wronged, but instead saw me as someone strong and independent. Those were the people who helped me heal the most, not through words or grand gestures, but through their steady presence and the simple act of being there. In the months that followed, I began to take more risks, small, calculated ones at first. I traveled to places I had always dreamed of seeing but never had the chance to visit. I explored new cities, tasted new foods, and took in the beauty of the world around me. I saw sunsets in places I had only ever read about, and I felt a sense of freedom that I had never known before. Each trip was an opportunity to reset, to reclaim the parts of me that had been lost. But travel wasn't the only way I was rebuilding. I started to remove the people from my life who were still tied to my past, those who clung to the narrative of the woman who had been betrayed. I didn't need those reminders anymore. I needed to move forward, and the only way to do that was to cut the dead weight loose. It was hard at first to let go of certain friendships, but I knew it was necessary for my growth. I was no longer the victim of my circumstances. I had learned that the only thing holding me back was myself. And then one day I met him. I had stopped looking for love, at least I thought I had. The scars from my marriage were still fresh, and I wasn't interested in complicating my life with another person. But he came into my life in the most unexpected way. We met through a mutual friend, and from the moment we started talking, I felt something shift inside me. He didn't look at me with pity or sympathy. He didn't know my past, and he wasn't trying to save me. He saw me for who I was now, a strong, capable woman who was building something new. He was different. He didn't ask about my history or press me about my past relationships. We built our bond slowly through shared interests and mutual respect. With him, I didn't feel like I was defined by my past mistakes or betrayals. I felt like I was seen for who I was in the present. And for the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of real companionship. It wasn't about him fixing me or completing me. It was about us building something together based on trust and understanding. I wasn't ready to jump into a new relationship right away. I needed time to process everything I had been through, and I wasn't about to let someone else's expectations define me. But with him there was no rush. We moved at our own pace, letting things unfold naturally. And as I spent more time with him, I realized that he wasn't the only one who had changed. I had transformed too. The emotional void that John and Katie had left behind was slowly being filled with healthier relationships and personal growth. I wasn't looking for validation anymore. I wasn't searching for someone to tell me I was worthy. I already knew that I was. In the quiet moments when I took a step back and looked at my life, I realized how far I had come. The pain of the past still lingered, of course, but it no longer defined me. It was a part of my story, yes, but it wasn't the story. I had learned to use my past as fuel, to turn the ashes of my former life into the foundation for something new. I had rebuilt my life piece by piece until it was something I could be proud of. And in that moment I understood what true strength was. It wasn't about revenge or getting even. It was about picking yourself up after everything falls apart, about using the lessons of the past to shape a better future. I had become someone stronger, someone who knew her worth. I had rebuilt myself, and now I was ready to live again. The quiet hum of the city outside was a soothing soundtrack to the evening. I sat by the window, a steaming cup of tea held loosely in my hands, and gazed out at the twinkling lights below. The world was still, and for the first time in a long time I felt at peace. There was a profound stillness inside me that I hadn't known in years, a calm that seeped into my very bones. Everything was exactly as it should be. The journey that had brought me here had been long, turbulent, and at times excruciating. But now, as I reflected on everything I had endured, I realized I had crossed the finish line. I had done the work, the emotional labor that no one could see. I had rebuilt my life from the ashes of betrayal, and it was a life I was finally proud to live. The anger that had once boiled in my chest, a fire that consumed me in my darkest moments, had faded. It wasn't gone exactly, but it had transformed into something else. Something more powerful, more enduring. It had become acceptance. I no longer carried the weight of the past like a burden, dragging it along with me everywhere I went. Instead, I had woven it into the fabric of who I was. It was a part of me now, yes, but it didn't define me. I had faced the worst of myself in those early days. I had seen the anger, the hurt, the raw, bleeding wound that was my heart, and I had faced it head-on. I had screamed, cried, and fought with the world around me, asking how this could happen, why it happened to me. And I had found no answers, only the harsh reality that some things were beyond my control. But in that acceptance I found strength. It was an odd feeling, one I hadn't expected. I had been so focused on seeking justice, on exacting my revenge, that I hadn't realized the ultimate victory was simply in learning to let go. As I sat there, the light from the city casting soft shadows over my reflection in the window, I couldn't help but marvel at how far I had come. It had been a process. There was no quick fix, no instant transformation. Each step had been deliberate, each action carefully thought out, but the journey had been worth it. I wasn't the same woman who had stood in that courtroom months ago, clutching divorce papers like they were the only thing keeping me afloat. That woman was gone. And in her place stood someone entirely new, someone who had found peace not in revenge but in self-discovery. I had won. But the real victory hadn't been in taking down John or Katie, though that had been a satisfying chapter of the story. No, the real triumph had been the quiet, unassuming victory of rebuilding myself. The strength I had cultivated, the resilience I had found in the darkest corners of my soul. Those were the things that mattered. The revenge that had once felt so necessary now seemed small, petty even. What had happened to John and Katie, whatever that was no longer my concern. Their downfall, their failure wasn't what had changed me. What had changed me was the act of walking away, of rebuilding my life from the inside out, of taking back my power piece by piece. There had been moments of doubt along the way. I'd stumbled, fallen, questioned whether I was making the right choices. But in the quiet of that evening, with nothing but the distant sound of traffic and the soft ticking of the clock beside me, I understood something deep and profound. Happiness was not something that could be given to me. It wasn't something someone could hand me like a prize. It wasn't something that came with revenge or the approval of others. Happiness was something I had to create for myself, and I had done it. There were no more dark nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if the pain would ever stop. There were no more moments of self-doubt, no more wondering if I had made a mistake in leaving. I had healed slowly but surely, until I was no longer the woman who had been betrayed. The betrayal, the lies, and the heartbreak no longer held the power they once did. They no longer had a grip on me, twisting my heart with each passing day. I had broken free. What had been a source of agony for so long had transformed into something more meaningful. The pain of my past had become the foundation of my strength. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sad or broken. I was whole. I could finally see it for what it was. The pain had been a lesson, and in learning from it I had grown. It was as if the fire that had once threatened to consume me had been tempered and forged into something strong and lasting. I leaned back in my chair, my gaze still fixed on the city lights outside. It was a new day. A new chapter. I had no idea what was ahead of me, but for the first time in ages I wasn't afraid. I wasn't afraid to live, to love, or to fail. I wasn't afraid to dream again, to rebuild from the ground up, and to embrace whatever came next. The future was mine to shape. It felt like an odd sort of freedom, one I hadn't known existed until now. The freedom to choose, to define myself by my own terms. No more did I feel the need to explain myself to others or seek their approval. I no longer measured my worth by the standards of the people who had hurt me or judged me. I was enough just as I was. In the quiet of that evening, a strange sense of gratitude began to bloom inside me. It wasn't for the betrayal, of course, not for the hurt or the lies. But I was grateful for the lessons I had learned, the strength I had discovered within myself. I was grateful for the resilience that had carried me through the darkest moments, for the clarity that had come with time. I was grateful for the woman I had become. As I sat there, reflecting on the chaos that had once defined my life, I realized that I didn't regret a single step of the journey. Not the pain, not the heartbreak, not the anger. It had all led me here to this moment of clarity. And in that clarity I found peace. This was my life now. I had reclaimed it piece by piece. I had found myself again in the wreckage of the past, and I had built something stronger from the ruins. No one could take that from me. I was the author of my own story, and I had finally written the ending I had always deserved. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air wash over me through the open window. It was time to step forward. The morning light filtered gently through the blinds, casting soft shadows across the room. Tessa sat on the edge of her bed, her feet planted firmly on the floor, and for the first time in a long while she felt at peace. It wasn't just the quiet of the room or the stillness of the morning. It was something deeper. She had stepped into her new life, a life she had fought for, a life she had rebuilt. And for the first time in years she felt truly free. The weight of the past no longer pressed down on her chest. No longer did she wake up with the heaviness of regret, the sharp sting of betrayal, or the uncertainty of what the day would bring. Now every morning was a gift, a fresh start, a chance to live without the shadows of what had once been, to embrace the day with gratitude and openness. Her mind drifted to the past, to the moments that had shaped her, those late-night tears, the sleepless nights where she had questioned her worth, the hurtful words spoken in anger. She used to carry those memories like chains around her heart. But now they were just that, memories. The chains had long since been broken, and the woman who had once been shackled by her pain was no longer here. The new Tessa, the woman who stood tall and unshaken, was free. She had nothing to prove to anyone anymore. Not to John, not to Katie, not to anyone who had ever tried to define her or diminish her. She had spent too long seeking validation from others, seeking approval from people who didn't truly understand her. But that was all in the past. Now her life was her own to live, and she was the only one who could define her future. She didn't need anyone's approval, not anymore. She had come to understand that the only approval she needed was her own. Tessa stood up, walked over to the window and looked out at the city below. It was still early and the streets were just beginning to wake up. The world was moving on and she was moving with it. For the first time in a long time she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had taken control of her destiny one step at a time, and now she was walking the path that was truly hers. Her career had blossomed in ways she never thought possible. It had started slowly, tentative steps into projects she had always dreamed of but never had the courage to pursue. But now she was taking on challenges that excited her. She had found her rhythm, her passion. She was no longer working for approval, for recognition. She was working for herself. And that made all the difference. She poured herself into her work with a newfound sense of purpose, and the results spoke for themselves. She was thriving both professionally and personally. In her personal life, things were blossoming as well. She had surrounded herself with people who truly cared for her, who saw her for who she was, not as the victim of betrayal but as the woman she had become. Her relationships were deeper, richer, and more authentic. She had learned to trust again, but this time the trust wasn't about expecting others to save her. It was about trusting herself, knowing that she was capable of handling whatever life threw her way. And perhaps most importantly, Tessa had learned to love herself. The journey had not been easy, but she had reached a place where she could look in the mirror and smile. She could see the woman staring back at her. The woman who had survived, who had thrived, who had become stronger with every challenge. She was proud of who she had become, and that was a feeling she had never truly allowed herself to experience before. Self-love was no longer a foreign concept. It was the foundation of everything she did. Forgiveness had been one of the hardest lessons to learn. It wasn't for John or Katie, not in the way most people would think. She didn't forgive them for their sake. She forgave them for hers. Holding on to that anger, that resentment, it had only weighed her down. It had kept her tied to the past, to the people who had hurt her, and it had stolen her peace. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting what had happened. It didn't mean excusing the betrayal. It simply meant letting go. It meant releasing herself from the grip of anger that had once consumed her. The first time she truly forgave, it felt like a weight lifted off her shoulders. It wasn't easy and it didn't happen overnight, but with each passing day it became easier. She learned that forgiveness wasn't about the other person, it was about freeing herself. And in doing so she had unlocked a new level of peace, a peace that she had longed for but never thought she would find. The scars of betrayal, the emotional wounds that had once seemed so deep, would always remain. But they no longer defined her. They were simply reminders of her journey. They were the marks of a woman who had fought her way back from the edge, who had learned to rise again no matter how many times life had knocked her down. Those scars told a story, and it was a story she was proud to tell. Tessa knew now that she was no longer the woman who had been broken by lies, the woman who had been left in the dust, or the woman who had clung to a love that wasn't real. That woman was gone. The woman who had emerged from the ashes was someone entirely different. She was strong, resilient, and wise. She had learned not just to survive but to thrive. With each passing day she grew more confident, more comfortable in her own skin. She had shed the layers of doubt and insecurity that had once clung to her, and now she was free to be herself. She had come to understand that life was not about avoiding the storms. It was about learning how to dance in the rain. And now, she danced with all the grace of a woman who had been through the fire and come out stronger on the other side. Her future was hers to create. And though she didn't know exactly what lay ahead, she was no longer afraid. She had learned that the road to happiness didn't always follow a straight path, but she was ready for whatever twists and turns it brought. No matter what happened, she knew she could handle it. She had proven that to herself time and time again. Tessa stood tall, looking at her reflection in the window. For the first time in years she smiled. Not the smile of someone who was pretending to be okay, but the smile of someone who truly was. The road behind her had been difficult, but it had led her to this moment, and for that she was thankful. She had become the woman she was always meant to be, and there was no turning back. Her new beginning was more than just a fresh start. It was a declaration. A declaration that she was no longer defined by her past, no longer bound by the mistakes of others. She was free. And that, in itself, was the greatest victory of all.